Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, January 21st. Happy summer solstice, everyone. Today on Tuesdays, we usually have Mr. Dwoskin. So Mr. Dwoskin will present his In the Headlines lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Angela. And yes, you are right. Today is the first day of summer in the Northern Hemisphere. So, it doesn't feel all that summery, but that's the way the moon, the sun cycle works, not the moon, the sun cycle works. So it's the first day of summer, and I'm usually not that hot anymore. But I spoke last week about climate change and about global warming. And actually, it's a good way to segue into one of the big events of the news that hasn't gotten enough publicity, which is that this week there have been some enormous floods in northeastern India. And I was reading today that 5 million people have lost their homes and have been displaced. So it's not some kind of little local happening, but we are so far away, and news in other countries, especially non-European countries, don't make the headlines as much. And if 5 million people were displaced somewhere in North America, or in even in South America, the American public would sit up and take notice. But because it's happening in India, a place so far away, and eastern India, which is even the probably the most remote part of India as a whole, it hasn't been given the attention that it deserves. I just would finish off by saying that they had some huge rains, some tremendous rains, but that part of India is known to get a lot of rain. What's happened is that the Brahmaputra River, which is one of the main rivers coming out of the Himalayas, has burst its banks, and therefore, of course, people are displaced. Now, part of the reason for the severe damage, and this happens all around the world also, is that you have a combination of weather changes or climate change, overpopulation and overstressing of the local environment. In the case of Eastern India, you have many people settling on land which before was not suitable to be settled on, but population sort of growth leads to pushing people to the edges of rivers, to floodplains, to low-lying lands which normally wouldn't be settled. And then you have the even more kind of, let's say, negative occurrences of cutting down of trees upriver. So trees are becoming very valuable. The area in Eastern India has lots of very valuable trees, so it's kind of jungly in a way. And the moment you cut trees down by a riverbank, there's no roots to hold the soil together. And when water comes rushing down, it just takes away the the surrounding riverbank and pushes everything down. And that's how you get all the damage downstream. So it's a combination of climate change, which is indirectly caused by the people who are living there, and local destruction, which is caused by the people living there. And the two together lead to this sort of catastrophe. In any case, if you're interested in this, you can follow it on the news or Google the Indian floods. But the large easternmost state, Assam, the Assam province is the one that's been affected. And in that area, is where India gets most of the most rainy parts of the whole country are in that upcountry area of Assam and the neighboring small states. So they're used to getting a lot of rain, but this is just a kind of like a deluge. In any case, that's just that. I wanted to get on the subjects of today. And the subjects of today have to do with elections. And I wanted to mention three specific elections which have taken place and which will take place. And these elections are, of course, are indicative of the state of mind and the mood of the people. And where there is a change in the state of mind and the mood of the people, there's a change in the elected officials that are going to run the country. And we had a very significant election, two significant ones this week, and one upcoming, which of course you all have heard about. So let me start maybe with the one which is the lesser known one, which was the elections in Colombia. And I'll speak a little bit about Colombia just as a kind of a very brief introduction without too many details. It's a country which I have visited twice and which is got some unique aspects to it. One of the most unique aspects to it is it's one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. So in other words, it has, I think it's the second most biodiverse country in the world, meaning it has the most variety of animals, of birds, and that's because it ranges from the high Andes Mountains down to the coast with all kinds of levels in between. Of course, everybody knows that Colombia is the third largest producer of coffee in the world and has been a coffee producer for well over 100 years because of the unique properties of being located in the zone between the equator and the tropics of Cancer, and the coffee and cocoa can grow only in the zone in between the Tropic of Capricorn and Cancer. In other words, areas close to the equator, but also it grows best on higher shaded areas, which Colombia has plenty of. Colombia is the third largest country in Latin America and by population. So its population is over 50 million, meaning that it's 20 or 25% bigger than Canada in population. Like many Latin American countries, it's affected by the extreme division between the well-off and the poorer off. And I was just reading part of the facts on Colombia, which is that 40% of the people live on less than $100 US a month. That's really quite shocking. I'm not even sure I believe that, but that's what I saw somewhere. And it means that, there are a lot of poor people, a relatively small middle class, and a relatively small upper class, which has a lot of economic resources. The country is predominantly made up of mestizos, which are mixtures between the Spanish settlers and the native indigenous people who were there. And there is a good 30 to 35% of people who are of strictly European ancestry, and another 7 or 10% of people who are Black, descendants of slaves that were brought to the Pacific coast by the Spanish rulers and later by the independent Colombians. The church for a long time, along with the landowners, ran the country after independence. Colombia became independent, when all the other Latin American countries did in the 1810s and 1820s. At one time, Colombia was a lot larger than it is today. Specifically, it owned what we call today Panama. And the United States paid off Colombia to give independence to Panama so that the United States could then pay off Panama to build the Panama Canal in the early 1900s. So before that, Colombia ranged all the way up as far as um, the southern part of Central America, in other words, up to the Costa Rican border. And down in the Amazon, Colombia also controlled territories which are now part of Brazil. So it was a country where after, in the 19th century, you had a kind of establishment of, we'll call them center-left and center-right parties, which alternated power for over 100 years, sometimes gently, sometimes not so gently. But things started to change really a lot after the 1960s. And that's because of drugs. So drugs became popular, specifically cocaine, in the 1960s and 70s in the US. And drug cartels were formed to process this cocaine, to ship it, to smuggle it, and to invest the profits that were received in all kinds of various ways. You heard of Pablo Escobar. He was the drug king, the head of the Medellin cartel. And he ran this cartel in a very violent way through the 1980s, into the 1980s, from the 1970s especially to the 80s. And they even had a submarine, which we know was smuggling cocaine, under the ocean all the way to the US. The difference in price between a kilo of cocaine, which cost $1,500 to process, and the selling price in the US of $50,000 a kilo, meant that, it was a very profitable item. And, a lot of people got into it, and, drugs beget violence, and violence beget violence. And Escobar himself was thought to have murdered hundreds of people, including the policemen, police, forces, judges, journalists, innocent bystanders, etc. And he is very, still to this very day, he's hated in Colombia. And, a lot of tourists have heard of his house and wanted to go see it. And, we did as well. And then we were very profoundly discouraged by the tourist authorities, because they don't want to make they don't want to make him into a hero, and they don't want to have his family somehow benefit from all of his misdeeds. There was an opposition cartel called the Cali cartel, based in Cali, which kind of assisted in getting rid of Escobar, and set up their own kind of monopoly in the drug trade. But eventually they were also brought down, and the whole drug trade kind of was broken up into smaller groups, let's call it. All of this kind of anarchy led to a sort of we'll call it a civil war, which erupted in Colombia between sort of left-wing forces using the drug money, and right-wing forces or paramilitary type police forces also using the drug money to supply themselves with weapons. And this civil war again lasted for 20 or 30 years. The left-wing guerrillas formed an organization called FARC, and there were other smaller organizations as well. And they tried to take over land and kind of live a communistic style lifestyle while supporting themselves partly in the drug trade. And anyone who didn't support them was kicked out or killed. The right-wing militias, sometimes backed by the government, saw their jobs as trying to defeat the left-wing militias, and some parts of Colombia were completely destabilized for, as I said, maybe 30 odd years. In the middle 2010s, talks started to happen. And in 2016, there was an agreement that was signed whereby the left-wing guerrillas would lay down their arms, the right-wing guerrillas would lay down their arms, the left-wing guerrillas would get some seats in the guaranteed seats in the assembly. Land would be taken and distributed to peasants who were supporting the left-wing guerrillas. And, this agreement was something which was quite historic. And the president of Colombia at the time won a Nobel Prize for, his name was Santos, won a Nobel Prize for a Peace Prize for arranging this arrangement. Of course, things didn't work out exactly the way they were supposed to. There were some guerrillas who refused to lay down their arms. Land reform didn't happen as quickly as it was supposed to. But nevertheless, it did put an end to the sort of widespread civil war and unrest that was happening in the country. At the same time, Venezuela was falling apart. Cesar Chavez and Maduro, next door to Colombia, basically took a reasonably off country and turned it into a communistic style dictatorship. That led to poverty, and the poverty led to the exile of millions of Venezuelans. And Colombia did receive millions of refugees and allowed them to stay and helped some of them to move on to third countries. And millions of them are still sitting in Colombia now, as refugees. So that's a kind of a very shorthanded, quick background report on the country. It has some tremendous natural resources. It's an oil producer, not on the first level, but on the second level. It has a coal production also, which is quite important, especially nowadays. It's the world's #1 country in emerald, emerald gems. Not that they're such a strategic resource, but interesting as it is. And of course, they are the #3 coffee producer in the world after Brazil and Vietnam. And coffee is something whose price is going up. Coffee is something where demand is not going down. And the coffee producers in Venezuela are the closest ones who lead to leading a middle-class lifestyle. And tourism. I mean, the city, especially the city of Cartagena, is kind of a world-class tourism city. Anyone who hasn't been there, and I've been there twice, I have to say, it's a well worth it place to visit. A walled city, established by the Spanish as one of their capitals in South America. And it still retains its very charming historical character in the walled city up until today. So tourism until COVID, of course, was one of the big money earners of the country. And needless to say, like the whole rest of the world, Colombia was affected by COVID. Tourism stopped coming, and a big source of foreign exchange was lost. And, needless to say, these things take time to rebuild. The elections which were held today, this month, were in a certain way similar to elections that I'll be speaking about, after this. But it was a rejection of both the political parties that had run the country for years. In other words, a kind of a center-left party and a sort of center-right party. Both of those were rejected by the voters. Colombia has a system of runoff elections where the top two candidates, if they don't get, if the one guy doesn't get 50%, then there's a runoff with the top two vote getters. And in the case of Colombia, the top two vote getters, neither of them were from the traditional parties which had run the country for 150 years. The top two vote getters were a man named Petro and another man named Hernandez. And the first one is the fellow who won, was a young 30-year-old something, but from the far left, who made a kind of an alliance with all the left anti-government forces. He ended up winning exactly 50% of the vote. The man on his opponent was a high-tech millionaire, non-political, not associated with previous political establishment parties, and he won 47% of the vote. So it was a very close election, but Mr. Preto won the election. He had unusually a Black vice presidential candidate, as did Mr. Hernandez. And the Black people in South America, as you probably know, you may not know, but socially and economically, we're exactly in the same position, if not worse, than the Black people living in the United States. So the poorest people, the most marginalized, the least educated, the people with the worst health outcomes, people who are discriminated against, people who have the least amount of education. This was the lot of the Black people living in South America, all of whom were descendants of slaves brought there by the Spanish or the Portuguese. Slavery was abolished in Colombia in the 1850s, but it was abolished in Brazil, which is the largest country in the continent, and the country with the most Blacks. Slavery was only abolished there in 1888. So, as I said, Black people had the same type of social discrimination and economic poverty as Blacks in the South. Perhaps you might say some of the only differences are that interracial marriages or liaisons are much more accepted in South America, and therefore you've got lots of people of mixed ancestry coming and going. The woman who became vice president in this election, she was a former maid. So it tells you how the new government of Colombia is one which is sort of out of the box on the one hand, and whose candidate for the winning candidate for president is really associated with this sort of far left wing of South American politics. People like Maduro or Chavez or Castro or Ortega. He's kind of in that mold. But what he isn't at this point is a dictator. And he doesn't have the backing of the National Assembly. In other words, his party didn't win enough seats to win a majority. And so, unless he does some sort of a coup in the country, he's going to be dependent on negotiating and compromising in order to get anything done in the country. What he's advocated is, of course, to get away from oil and coal exports, which are the big money earners in the country. Colombia, by the way, is also the largest producer of fresh flowers in South America. And all of the fresh flowers that you get that are shipped into the US, things like carnations and roses, a lot of them come from Colombia. And it's been, and as well as bananas and other tropical fruits. So, it does have a kind of a varied economy in that sense, but fragile. The drug trade is still being carried on, but there's a lot of efforts to change the crop from coca to other ones, which is not easy to do. There's a lot of effort to suppress the drug trade, which again, because of its such profitability, is not easy to do. And so long as demand for cocaine is going to be present in the US, that's the first market. Interestingly enough, though, the demand for cocaine in the US has gone down. And when that happened, the drug cartel people decided to push their product over to Europe. And so there is now a big trade in smuggling cocaine from Colombia to Europe, sometimes often via African countries who are easily bribed. And, they are the main suppliers now of cocaine to Europe, where demand is growing, whereas in the US it's not growing. So, that's a little bit about the drug trade. He also wants to tax the rich, tax corporations, lower inequality, provide services to, things like housing and medical care to people who don't have it. But of course, none of this is free. And how he's going to get the money to do this is always a question. He also wants to have closer relations with those dictator left countries that I mentioned before. And, this could be sort of a harbinger of a movement to the left in South America, most notably in the next door country, Brazil, which has elections coming up later this year. Lula da Silva, the former president, is running against the current president, Bolsonaro, who has a very mixed record on COVID and on the economy. And it's not unlikely that da Silva will win the elections, and therefore you will have a kind of a left bloc in South America, which is getting bigger with countries, like Brazil, Colombia, of course, Venezuela, Peru, just elected a leftist type government. It remains to be seen about Argentina and Uruguay, and Chile also, which also just had elections and also elected a kind of, not leftist, but at least a kind of a center-left government. So that seems to be the trend there in South America. So I wanted to move on now to the next election. And actually, you could ask me questions about everything at the end. Maybe it's easier to do it that way, which is in France, which had elections this weekend on Sunday. And this was the second round of elections in that country to elect a parliament or an assembly. Just to explain again, because sometimes it's confusing, the French political system is a combination of a sort of the American system where you directly elect a president by popular vote, and a parliamentary system made up of districts like we have in Canada or Great Britain, where each district elects their own member, and the party with the most districts can nominate the prime minister. So that's how it works. The president has powers over the sort of general well-being of the country, foreign affairs, defense affairs, things like that. And his prime minister is the one who sort of looks after the day-to-day operation of the government. So that's the sort of setup in France. And the presidential elections were just held, as you might remember, a month ago. And Mr. Macron was re-elected, which is not that common, but he was re-elected, but with a much reduced majority in a two-way race over Miss Le Pen, where the previous elections, Macron had 80% and Le Pen had 20%. This time it was closer to 60% for Macron, in the 50% for Macron, and then the 40% for Le Pen. So, his opposition grew quite strongly in that election. But in the parliament, but also in what was surprising in the first round of the elections is that the left-wing bloc fared almost enough to push to second place over Ms. Le Pen. And in the parliamentary elections, the left-wing bloc did really very, very well. They were expected to do well, and they did well, because this was a bloc that was constructed by Mr. Mélenchon, who is a kind of we'll call him an outcast leftist rebel. And he assembled a coalition of his own party, which is the outcast leftist rebel party, we'll call it. It's a good name. And the old Socialist Party of France, which has much reduced in its power. The old Communist Party of France, which is much reduced in its support. And the Green Party in France, which, like many Green parties, has a core of dedicated voters interested in green climate type subjects. So that was his main coalition with a couple other odds and ends. And, they stuck together this time and didn't run separately. And for that reason, they did quite well in the parliamentary vote. Macron's party had a majority in the last assembly. You need about 290 seats to have a majority, and he had over 300 last time. But this time he only managed to get 245, and this leftist coalition ended up with 130. But the biggest sort of surprise, or we'll say the biggest improvement, was made by Mrs. Le Pen's party, which only had 8 seats in the last parliament, and they went up to 90 or 89 this time. So from 8 to 89 is really a huge jump. They're less than the other opposition party. But if you add the far left opposition and the far right opposition together, in other words, you add 131 and 89, you get 220. And it means that the far left and the far right control 220 seats out of 577. So it's really a statement saying that the French population are fed up with old-time politics. And it's a kind of a mirror of what happened in Colombia, where the traditional center-right and center-left parties were eliminated or defeated. This time in France, they weren't eliminated or defeated, but they were much reduced in their, in their political support, to the point where, well over a third of the seats are held by these two radical extremes, we'll call them. And it makes it, of course, difficult to govern for Macron without a majority. But there are other parties that did get elected. The old-time Republican Party got elected. Some regional parties got elected. Some independents got elected. And, he'll have to use his negotiating skills to come up with some sort of a government. That's his job. Not easy at a time when inflation is hitting France like everything else. The war in the Ukraine is affecting the country. The decision on how much to back the Ukraine and how much money to send them is a decision. The other big decisions are to the relations with Great Britain and quarrels about the agreement of Great Britain leaving the European Union, the issue of migrants, and how much to allow migrants to come into France, what to do with them once they get there. Many migrants want to go into England, and should France be stopping them? These are some of the important kind of issues facing the country, as well as all the other issues facing every other Western country, which is you have an aging population. In France, actually, one of the issues is to raise the retirement rate from 62 to 65. So France has a very low retirement age. And after 62, at this point, you could get your full pension, part of which is paid by the state. Since, demographic trends are the same there as everywhere else. In other words, the country is getting older and older, and there's fewer young people working to support all the old people retiring. The budget is going to be constrained by that. And France, Mr. Macron, wanted to raise the retirement age to 65, which is much more like it is in other countries. And, the leftist opposition was not happy with that. And it remains to be seen if that's one of the major reforms that he'll be able to push through. So just a little focus on that country. France, as you all know, is very one of the most dependent on tourism of countries in Europe. France is I think the second most visited country in all of Europe, if not the first most. And the COVID has certainly been something which affected the tourism industry in France as well as everywhere else in the world. And, things are coming back now, but they're not back to where they were. So, Mr. Macron is going to have to use all of his skills to make a government and to hold it from falling apart. Talking about governments falling apart, the third subject of today, as you heard, we'll continue talking about that, is that it was announced yesterday that the Israeli government is going to fall apart, and that elections will in all likelihood be held in October. And I was looking at a list of democratic countries, and since 1996, Israel holds the record of all democratic countries for most elections since 1996. And Israel was averaging 2.4, its governments were lasting an average of 2.4 years, which is low. And with this new election coming up, that average is going to go down maybe to 2.0 years, because this will be the fifth election in 4 years in the country. Needless to say, that's not a terribly strong vote of confidence in the system or in the government or in democracy. But given the givens and given the Israeli system of government, it is what it is, as they say. Unlike in France and unlike in the US and unlike in Canada, Israel, as you know, has a proportional representation system with a minimum number of votes of 3.25% in order to be elected. So any party getting over 3.25% of the votes is guaranteed 4 seats in the Knesset, because there's 120 seats in the Knesset. And, if you divide all the valid votes up, then you get 3.25% of the vote. It comes out to about 4 seats out of 120. So 4 is the minimum number. And there has never been, since 1940, the first election in 1949, there's never been a majority government in the country because of this proportional system. There are no districts whatsoever. There was once or twice a direct vote for the prime minister, but that was canned after relatively unsuccessful experiment. And so, when you have 33 parties running for office and you have 13 odd parties elected, it's impossible to get a 50% majority. And therefore, coalition politics being what they are, it leads to instability. And sure enough, the government was not able to last. The current government in Israel is really quite remarkable. It's a first in many ways, but we'll talk about that a bit later. The government, as it was constituted, had 61 members supporting it out of 120. In other words, all it took was one member or two members to bring the government below the 61 required. And that's what happened. There were defections of different coalition members at different times. And it was impossible to keep on governing after 1 year when this government was established. So it was established a year ago. It was a unique combination of political parties, 7 of them, 7, believe it or not, 7, ranging from the left to the right, from religious to secular, as well as Arab party for the first time in Israeli history. And they all got together with the one goal of keeping Netanyahu out of power. And they succeeded after 12 years of Netanyahu's government to form a government which would exclude him, much to his great shock. They had agreed on a rotation formula, which is not a first in Israel. In other words, that there would be one man chosen to be prime minister for the first half and then a second man for the second half. So this has been done before. In the rotation, Mr. Bennett got the first chance and Mr. Lapid was supposed to get the second chance. But the conflicts which got stronger and stronger and the divisions in the government which got stronger and stronger, and Mr. Netanyahu's efforts to remove, bribe, separate members from the coalition government, they all succeeded in not being able to make the government last. In a certain sense, you could say as a whole, if you took the picture as a whole, the government did not really represent the Israeli public as it is, because the Israeli government is mostly right-wing and religious. I should say the Israeli people are mostly right-wing and religious, and this government was not mostly right-wing and religious. And it was these differences which caused the government to eventually collapse. The sort of straws that broke the camel's back, we'll say, were issues that had to do with the Palestinians, as is logical. Israel still controls the West Bank, constituting about 2.5 million Arabs who don't have the right to vote, and who are kind of in limbo, we'll call political limbo. It's bound to lead to conflicts, and conflicts are what are, is part of the daily life of that. Most Israelis say, well, it's not an ideal situation, but we can't think of anything better. So, that's what the situation is. But there have been demonstrations on the Temple Mount, which have turned violent. The killing of this Arab Al Jazeera reporter who was very popular was very disturbing to some people. The refusal of the government to allow Palestinian spouses to have residency in Israel, the refusal of the government to provide electricity to Bedouin communities, the refusal of the government to include the Bedouin in the solar energy program. It put the Arab members of the coalition in a tough spot. Then the last thing was the extension of Israeli law to settlers, which have been renewed kind of every single year since 1967. Also put the Arab voters in a tough spot because they don't approve of this law. They don't like the idea that Israeli people who are not living in Israel proper, and that not even Israel has laid claim to the West Bank officially. Therefore, the Israelis who live there technically speaking, should be under military rule and not under civilian rule. And if you allow them to be, under civilian rule, then you're making a difference between them and their neighbors who are not under civilian rule, the Arab neighbors. Anyway, so this law has been sort of temporarily extended time after time, but the government could not get a majority to support the extension of this law. And if the law did not get extended, then all kinds of anarchy would break loose among the settlers in the West Bank. So these are some of the pressures that put the government in jeopardy and danger. One of the essential contradictions of the government was that Mr. Bennett and his party, called Yamina, which means right wing, he's the prime minister, but all of the voters of the Yamina party and many of the elected members, of whom there were only 7, are kind of right-wing religious nationalists. And the last thing they want is to have the Arab community of 21% be regarded as equal citizens, which is what the Arab party wanted. And they were the ones who deserted one by one, deserted his party to kind of go over to the Likud. And that made the government total go from 61 to 59. And that's why the government lost its majority. Netanyahu always accused the government of being traitorous because the traitoring aspect was that the government, the voters of the Yamina party did not expect the Yamina party to go over and make a government without Netanyahu. Up until now, Netanyahu and Yamina were, in the same coalition. Some of Mr. Bennett himself and his number 2, Shaked, were top cabinet ministers in some of Netanyahu's governments. Mr. Bennett, if I'm not mistaken, was a right-hand man or personal assistant to Netanyahu for a long time. So, this sort of government established by what's supposed to be a close ally was particularly upsetting to the Likud party. And so they're jubilant now that they brought down the government. But the government made firsts in history. It was the first time that a religious kippah-wearing Jew was prime minister, which is Mr. Bennett. The first time that a small party leader became a prime minister. As I said, Bennett's party only had 7 seats out of 120, and yet he became prime minister. The first time that there was such a range of parties in the coalition, as I said before, from left to right, from secular to religious. The first time an Arab party was a full participant in the government, and I believe that's probably the biggest achievement of this government, because for 74 years, no Arab party agreed to be actively participating in a government with ministerial status, and no government would actively want an Arab party to be part of the government, except Mr. Netanyahu, of course. And when he got so desperate last time and couldn't get over the 60 seat mark, it was Mr. Netanyahu who asked the Arab Party, the United Arab List, led by Mansour Abbas. Mr. Abbas said, "I'd be willing to serve in Netanyahu's government." And Netanyahu said, "Sure, fine, let's do it." But then it was vetoed by the other potential member of his government, the ultra right-wing party called Religious Zionism, who said, "We can't serve in a government with them." And so that's what led to the election, and that's what led to the formation of this sort of coalition government. But it's the very first time that an Arab party agreed to participate in the government itself. And its goal was to say, look, we're not that interested in Palestinian politics and the whole Palestinian issue. but what we want is for Israeli Arab citizens to receive the same treatment and benefits as the Jewish ones. And that was his goal. And he's made some very specific requests, some of which were accepted, some of which were not. Some of the accepted requests were acted upon, some of which were not. And but it means that it's a kind of a template or an example that Israeli Arab parties could participate in a government. It remains to be seen, of course, how the Israeli Arab electorate will react in the upcoming elections. Will they reward Mr. Abbas for joining the government, or will they punish him for doing that? That kind of remains to be seen. It was the first time in a long time that the ultra-Orthodox factions didn't take part in the government, like over 30 years, because both ultra-Orthodox parties, the Sephardi one and the Ashkenazi one, decided to stay with Netanyahu in the opposition. It was the first time that a specifically racist party was allowed to be elected in the Knesset. Meir Kahane, who started this racist party, was elected once, and then the courts decided that racists could not be allowed to run for office. And yet this time, Mr. Netanyahu engineered a union between the religious, non-ultra-Orthodox religious party with this racist party, a successor of Kahane's party. And he did it so that these two parties together would pass over the threshold, which they did. And Mr. Smotrich and Ben Gvir, both of whom are well known to be extremists, were elected in the Knesset, and that's a first. Mr. Ben Gvir is the one who said that all Arabs should be kicked out of Israel, and he constantly is trying to create civil unrest between Jews and Arabs in order to show that the Arabs are not loyal to the state. So he's the one who goes up on the Temple Mount and then tries to antagonize the Muslims who are praying there, and that's his MO. It's the first time that a non-Haredi had the religious affairs ministry, because the ultra-Orthodox are not in the government. They couldn't run the religious affairs ministry, which they always did. And that led, so the one who is doing it up till now is an Orthodox kippah-wearing Jew from Mr. Bennett's party, but he's not a ultra-Orthodox Jew. And he set out a bunch of reforms to religious life in the country, which include who is nominating municipal rabbis, which rabbis can sit on religious courts, how kashrut supervision is going to be upheld, how the conversion process is going to be done. And in all of his steps in these areas opened up the field to non-ultra-Orthodox candidates. So previously, up until now, it was the ultra-Orthodox who nominated their own people for all of these posts. And now he's opened it up to non-Orthodox and even to, even to non-Orthodox rabbis to sit on municipal courts, rabbinical courts, etc. So even allowing conservative and reform rabbis to take part in some little way in the religious affairs of the country. He also allowed a kind of a opening up of the kosher supervision process. So it's not only in the hands of the chief rabbinate, but that local Orthodox rabbis would be allowed to supervise kashrut. And here's this, I'm sure you haven't heard of this one, that he is allowing kosher phones. You know what a kosher phone is? It's a phone, an iPhone that can't join the internet. So it's a phone which is limited in its capacity and can only download approved sources by the rabbinate, and that's called a kosher phone. But he's allowed these phones to be connected to the internet, in other words, to change their status, but without changing the phone number. That's the key. So in other words, somebody can just have a phone number, and unbeknownst to the rabbis and unbeknownst to their families even, they could just switch their phone to a regular type phone without changing the phone number. And, this of course means that the rabbis don't have control over somebody's internet practices, because they would find out, if anybody wanted to change their phone number, and they'd say, what's happening here? So that's a kind of a major change that was allowed as well. The fact that there was an Arab party in the government and Arab parties in the opposition means that Arab parties will compete against each other, not to be in the opposition, but should they be in the government or not in the government. The Arab voting turnout has always been lower than the Jewish voting turnout, partly because of the frustration with the system, partly because some just don't recognize the state of Israel at all, even now. And the previous election, not this one, but one or two previous, the Arab parties got 15 seats, which made them the third biggest party in the Knesset. And they still didn't, they weren't able to use their power to help their own selves. And so, in the next election, the turnout was much less, and the Arab party scored many fewer seats than before. So now what's going to happen is that, so just on that subject then, the Arab voters say, well, with all the seats we haven't seen any improvements. And now with the United Arab List Party, the Ram Party in power, we don't see much improvements. We see a few changes, but not many. So what's the point of voting? So that's the way some of the Arab electorate, especially the younger people, are thinking. And it remains to be seen, they could translate their numbers into significant power if they decided to go out and vote in substantial numbers. So Lapid is now going to become the prime minister, which he really should have been before, because he was the second biggest party in the Knesset after Netanyahu. But he generously gave up the spot in order to allow Mr. Bennett to bring on his religious supporters to form an anti-Netanyahu government. So now with the resignation of Bennett, Lapid becomes the new prime minister, and he's a prime minister not only until elections are called, but until a new government is formed. And sometimes there's a difference between winning an election and forming a government. So he's going to be the prime minister until at least the end of October. And being a prime minister gives you the usual sort of publicity and the usual prestige of shaking hands with foreign leaders and looking prime ministerial on TV, and being given a sort of a free mic, a free access to the media to present your ideas and your plans for the future. He's a secular centrist. His father was the founder of a party called Shinui, which is Change, which was also a secular centrist party. The center in Israel traditionally has never done well, but he has managed better than any other center parties to hang in there after several different elections. But they've never won more than 15% of the vote, which is not enough to really form a solid, strong bloc. Their polls that were published yesterday, which show him going from 17 seats to 20 seats, which is no big deal, and still not nearly enough to, make a claim on being a leader of the country. Some people would say, well, why did the current Israeli government vote to dissolve the government rather than wait for an opposition vote to dissolve the government? And that's just for politics. In other words, if a couple is breaking up, the one who decides to break up first is the one who gets the kind of reward. You're not telling me, you're not kicking me out, I'm leaving. So that's what happened in this case. And it is possible for Netanyahu to become prime minister without elections, but he has to get 61 members of the Knesset to support him. And it's theoretically possible if some of Mr. Bennett's former party people decide to support Mr. Netanyahu in exchange for some huge offers that Mr. Netanyahu is making. So he's running around to every coalition member who he thinks might go with him, promising rewards, jobs, posts, ministerial positions, cars, ambassadorships, you name it. He's got his whole crew out there trying to get enough people to support him so that he could become the prime minister without elections. So far, not many people have bid, but it's tempting. Let's put it like that. So just to review again, and I'll finish up here though, that the current government is made up of 7 different political parties, and Yamina was one of them, which is the right-wing party. And then you had sort of 2 right-center type parties based on personalities more than on policies. One led by Gideon Sa'ar, who was the former number 2 person in the Likud, who said, I'm not waiting for Netanyahu to quit before I can become a leader. And he decided to form his own party. And the attacks Mr. Netanyahu gave him were so strong that he decided to be part of the opposition coalition. Mr. Gantz, who is the leader of the Blue and White Party, formerly a union between himself and Lapid. And you might remember a couple of governments ago, Netanyahu promised Gantz the moon and the stars if Mr. Gantz would join him. He promised Mr. Gantz would be in a rotation agreement with Netanyahu becoming prime minister first and then Mr. Gantz. When Mr. Netanyahu's turn came to give up the power to Gantz, Netanyahu engineered the government falling so that he wouldn't have to give up power to Gantz. So Gantz was so betrayed that he also joined this opposition, a coalition against Netanyahu. So that's him. So those are 3 parties there. And then you other ones with Mr. Lieberman's party, Israel Beitenu, which is a strongly right-wing but secular party. He was also betrayed by Netanyahu. And then you've got the Labor Party, traditional Labor Party, the left-wing Meretz Party, and the United Arab List. So those are the parties that made up the coalition. They did succeed in passing 2 budgets, which Netanyahu never did, because, as I said, he didn't want to have his government be in power long enough to rotate, power with Mr. Gantz. It was a miracle to get the coalition to work for a year and to get Mr. Netanyahu out. And the world, by and large, the world's democracies welcomed, the alternative to Netanyahu. Only Trump was Netanyahu's friend, really. Trump and Putin and Viktor Orban, they were all his fans. But the rest of the democratic world, not so much. The fact is, in a certain way, that Netanyahu has all the cards and it's his election to lose. But Mr. Lapid is a very strong politician, and he's going to try his hardest to assemble a similar type coalition to keep Netanyahu out of power. this religious Zionist party that I mentioned before is sort of the one that Netanyahu encouraged to get into the Knesset, is now polling so strongly that they're polling now 10 seats, which is really a large improvement over the 5 that they ended up with. And their growth is because the leader of the party is so racist and so outspoken that he's able to gather to himself these sort of elements of the far right ultra-nationalist part of the Israeli electorate. And most interestingly, the ultra-Orthodox Haredim, in other words, the black coat guys, many of the younger ones are deserting their traditional parties and supporting this religious Zionism party over the objections of their own rabbis. So that's a very interesting development. It remains to be seen how that will work out. The 3.25% floor or minimum that's required to get into the Knesset is one which could threaten several of the coalition parties now. And if any of these coalition parties don't make it, of course, all their votes are lost, and this will be to Mr. Netanyahu's gain. Whereas the 4-party coalition that Mr. Netanyahu has, which is his party, the Likud, this racist party, and the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, they're way over the 3.25%. So really all the cards are in Mr. Netanyahu's hands to win the next election. And, the only thing that might let's say, derail that would be if finally Mr. Netanyahu is found guilty in court of the 3 different charges that he's been charged with, but the courts are afraid to touch, the courts are a bit of afraid to stick him in the courtroom because he starts yelling and screaming, this is all a political witch hunt. So, that's basically the story there. And it's after 3 o'clock, so thanks again. And now I'm going to ask Angela for anyone has questions, comments on France, on Colombia, on Israel, or anything else. You notice I haven't spoken about the American hearings on the January 6th riot, and maybe that could be a subject for next week. So, yeah, let's hear what you have to say.
There's nobody yet, Mr. Dwoskin.
I think that we lost our good friend Steve, who is such a great listener and questioner, and one who would always like to make sure his opinion is presented. But think of it. Let me know. I'm here for, if we were in person, which I would love to be. People look at people, and I could ask people what they think, and it's kind of a more intimate setting, and so people always have comments and questions. It's very hard to talk to a machine, a computer, a phone, an iPad, and pretend that you're speaking to somebody, because all you're doing is looking at an iPad. Well, if that's the case, Angela, tell me if there's nothing else. I want to thank everybody for listening, thank everybody for being tuning in. I hope that you learned something that you didn't know before. That's the whole idea of this. And I'll see you all next week. So thanks again, Angela, and thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening over the telephone and on Zoom. We shall see you again next Tuesday. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.